Hello, I am Baal Kadmon, and I would like to thank you for watching or listening to this podcast. It's been a while. Today I'm going to read you 2 chapters from my upcoming book, Asherah, the Queen of Heaven, Canaanite Magick, Book 1. It is available for pre-order right now on Amazon.com. I hope you enjoy it. Introduction. Asherah has always enchanted me. I recall when I was a young boy learning the Jewish faith that much of my Sephardic father's family followed. I remembered reading verses from the Bible, more specifically the Old Testament, that would mention her name. It was one of the very first times I encountered the actual names of the other gods in the Old Testament. Instead of being repelled by her, I was drawn to know more about her. I discovered that she was at least as important as the other Canaanite gods such as Baal and El. She is, of course, far more than just a Canaanite goddess. Canaanite religion has always been interesting to me because it seems so elusive and dark. The fact that it was in direct opposition to the Hebrew faith gave me a wee bit of satisfaction at the time. What can I say? Sacrilege and blasphemy started early for me. In the Bible, we find that the Israelites had many enemies. The 2 that appear most prominently in the Bible are the Egyptians and the Babylonians. However, I would like to counter that claim. Yes, the Hebrews were enslaved by the Egyptians, at least according to the Bible. And yes, the Babylonians sent the Israelites into a cruel exile which left lasting impressions we still see in modern Judaism to this day. However, the biggest enemy, in my estimation, were the Canaanites. I say this for 2 reasons. Archaeologically speaking, it appears that perhaps many Israelites themselves were just breakaway Canaanites, so it was in their blood, so to speak. This is a popular view amongst those who ascribe to the biblical minimalist school of thought. I personally have 1 foot in biblical minimalism myself. Although that certainly makes sense to me, it is still not 100% proven. Archaeology is still very much on top of this issue. I could go on and on about this, but this is not the book about biblical archaeology. Although it is a little bit. By far, the greatest threat to the Israelites was the Canaanite religion and its ever-present theological threat. As much as the Israelites tried to resist, the Canaanite religion would either seep into the Hebrew faith in covert ways, or they were tempted to worship Canaanite gods outright. Israelites backslide time and time again to the religion of the Canaanites. Even when they emerged from it, Canaanite ideas were well transcribed into the DNA of Israelite religion. This is where Asherah comes in. Notice I do not call it Judaism. Judaism emerges from the Hebrew Israelite faith, but cannot really be called Judaism proper until much, much later. Israelite faith, and later, by extension, Judaism, at least on the surface, does not have a divine feminine within its theological practices and beliefs. However, upon closer examination, we find that they couldn't suppress the divine feminine completely. It was Asherah who emerged as the consort to the Hebrew god. This is, of course, quite scandalous, yet some interesting evidence is present to suggest this. A few books exist on Asherah, so I'm going to jump in and add my 2 cents. I found that the other books were rather complex. I will do my best to deconstruct it all in this book, but for the sake of brevity, I can't go too deep. Like all my books, I will cover the texts and the history. I have many old notes that I will clean up and present here. We will discuss Asherah's wide-ranging presence from Akkadian religion sources all the way through the Arabian ones and everything in between. We will start with the Old Testament sources first, since that is essentially what put her on the map of intellectual history, so to speak. We will also learn more about ways to call upon her and tap into her ancient power. She is, after all, the divine consort of God, the Queen of Heaven. Asherah in the Old Testament. As I indicated in the introduction, Asherah is far more than a Canaanite goddess. Her influence has been widespread throughout the Middle East and parts of North Africa. Although her cult was not as long-lived as, let's say, that of one of my patronesses, the great goddess Isis of the ancient Egyptian was, her cult, however, was far more pervasive within the region than that of Isis. In many ways, the cult of Isis benefited from the attention she garnered from the civilizations that appreciated her exoticism and Egyptian lore in general, mainly the Greeks and the Romans, who of course had the great ability to disseminate information across wide swaths of the Mediterranean and beyond. either by the pen or by the sword. It is for this reason you can find remnants of Isis's cult as far away as Londinium, present-day London, via the Romans. The form found there has only partial resemblance to her original form in Egypt. Her cult was Hellenized. So in essence, Asherah's cult was and remained regional, whereas the Isis cult went international. Asherah's cult was not quite as exotic, for she, despite being Queen of Heaven, existed within a framework that did not distinguish her in ways that Isis was distinguished. This is partly because inscriptions of her are not as robust as that of Isis. There are many, though. In addition, she would be, of course, later demonized by Western religions because of her mention in the Bible. Isis was never directly mentioned in it. I'm not even aware of even a hint of Isis in the Bible. Which brings us to the topic at hand. In this chapter, we will discuss Asherah and her presence in the Old Testament tradition. Chronologically, I should not start this book with Asherah's appearance in the Bible, since her worship predated many biblical mentions of her, i.e. via Ugaritic texts, which we will discuss later. The reason I'm starting with the Old Testament mention of her is because that is how most of us know about her. Asherah is featured quite a few times in the Old Testament. She was a thorn in the side of the Israelites. In the Old Testament, she is identified either directly by name or by her cult object, the wooden Asherah poles, or Asherim, or Ashterot. To be more precise, Asherah is mentioned 40 times in the Old Testament, of which 33 of those times appear to be referring to her by her sacred cult object. The fact that she was often identified by these poles led many scholars to believe Asherah was not a goddess, but a description of a pagan cult object. One of the reasons for this is due to the fact that we find mention of these poles using the word in Hebrew, Asherim, which is a plural word and used when referring to more than one of these poles. This theory was later abandoned when it was found in the Ugaritic text that Asherah was, in fact, a prominent goddess. We will look at a few passages in the Old Testament that indicate that she was, in fact, a goddess, but also some verses that also suggest a religious cult object. I will supply both the English and the Hebrew text of each verse I will mention. 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 13. He also deposed his mother Maachah from the rank of the queen mother, because she had made an abominable thing for Asherah. וגם את מעכה אמו, ויסיריה מגבירה אשר עשתה מפלצת לאשרה. This is an interesting passage. The word for abominable thing in Hebrew is mifletzet. This technically means a detestable image or an abominable image. In modern Hebrew, this word also means monster. So apparently an image to Asherah was considered monstrous. Also notice that the letter Lamed before the Asherah indicates 4 or 2. I mention this because this indicates that in this verse she is referred to as an individual being. We find another in 2 Kings chapter 21 verse 7. It states, "And he set the graven image of Asherah that he had made in the house of which the Lord said to David and Solomon to his son, In this house and in Jerusalem which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel will I put my name forever." וישם את פסל האשרה אשר עשה בבית אשר אמר אדוני אל דוד ואל שלמה בנו. בבית הזה ובירושלים אשר בחרתי מכל שבטי ישראל, אשים את שמי לעולם. The first arrow on the left is pointing to the name Asherah, and the one to the right is pointing to the letter He. In this case, the actual translation of this word would be the Asherah. Some have used this as evidence that it wasn't a singular goddess per se, but a kind of goddess or a kind of cult object, since it does not refer to her as an individual entity as in the previous verse. This can also be found with Lilith. Some texts refer to her as Lilim or Lilin. This word is plural and indicates a kind of class of Lilith-like entities. In ancient Babylon, the Lilitu was a class of entity. In the next verse of 2 Kings, we find her being referred to more as a goddess. It also mentions her consort, Baal. 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 4. And all the vessels that were made for Baal and for Asherah, and for all the hosts of heaven. את כל הכלים העשויים לבעל ולאשרה ולכל צבאה השמיים. The red arrow is pointing to Asherah, and the yellow arrow says to Baal. This verse is clear indication that Asherah is a spiritual being and a goddess. The other interesting part of this verse is that after Asherah is mentioned, it states, and for all the hosts of heaven. This implies that not only Baal and Asherah are divine, they are also part of the hosts of heaven. Interesting word usage by the biblical writers, don't you think? In 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 19, it states, Now therefore send and gather to me all Israel unto Mount Carmel, and the prophets of Baal 450, and the prophets of Asherah 400, that eat at Jezebel's table. ואתה שולח כבוץ אלי את כל ישראל אל הר הכרמל, ואת נביאי הבעל 450, ונביאי האשרה 400, אוכלי שולחן איזבל. The first highlight is the prophets of the Baal, and the other one, the prophets of the Asherah. Let us look at one more verse and then we will move on. The following verse again will use Asherah's name and Baal's name, for that matter, as plural. Judges chapter 3, verse 7. And the children of Israel did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, and forgot the Lord their God, and served the Baalim and the Asherot. ויעשו בני ישראל את הרע בעיני אדוני, וישכחו את אדוני אלוהיהם, ועבדו את הבעלים ואת האשרות. The arrow to the left is pointing to the Asherot, and the right arrow is pointing to the Baalim. This literally means the Asherahs and the Baals, as if they were a class of beings. Another explanation is that they were referring to variants of Asherah and Baal that were present throughout the region. Not all cultures and locales who worshipped Baal and Asherah did so in the same way. Even the names were slightly different in some instances, but they were still recognized as Baal and Asherah. For example, we have Baal Peor, or the Baal of Peor, which is, a side note, is where the demon name Belphegor comes from. We also have Baal Zvuv, also known in English as Beelzebub, which means Lord of the Flies, or literally Baal of Flies. Some have suggested because the Hebrews did not consider these entities as being anything more than idols, they objectified them with the, as if they were an object. But as we have seen, there was also reference to Asherah as well. Since we already know that Baal was in fact a god in a few mythological texts, having Asherah's name show up with his indicates she too is a goddess. Another way Asherah was identified was by her cult object, which I hinted at earlier. Often one of the plurals of Asherah's name is Asherim, would also refer to a grove or a kind of tree, and in some cases a man-made cult object or wooden Asherah pole. Here are a few examples of this in the Old Testament. I will first present it in English and then in Hebrew. 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 23. For they also built them high places and pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every leafy tree. ויבנו גם המה להם במות ומצבות ואשרים על כל גבעה גבוהה ותחת כל עץ רענן. In this example, you can see that it is clearly referring to an object most definitely associated with Asherah herself. In the next verse, instead of using Asherim or Asherot as plurals of Asherah, it uses Asherah singular and uses language that objectified the name. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 33. And Ahab made the Asherah. V'yaseh Achav et ha'asherah. There are a few more instances, but for the sake of brevity, let us move on. Now that we have seen the distaste the biblical authors had for Asherah, let us look a bit more behind the scenes. The inscriptions I will discuss now are so controversial that I'm shocked that they aren't cited more often outside of the ivory towers of academia. Well, I guess I could see why they would be ignored. It has the potential to upend the entire modern conception of the early Hebrew faith. Before I go on, I would like to clarify one thing. God in the Old Testament has several names, one of which is Yud-He-Vav-He, or some people say Yahweh, but a lot of people would pronounce it Yehovah. In fact, that is the main name, the Tetragrammaton, as it is also known. It is often translated in English as Lord, and sometimes pronounced in Hebrew, or most of the time, Adonai. The reason I mention this will be clear in a moment. There was an ancient shrine found in the Sinai Peninsula dating around the 9th to 8th century BC, called Kuntilat Ajrud. They found an inscription in early Hebrew, but in Phoenician script. Many inscriptions involve El, Baal, and Asherah, and the deities often associated with that general area. There is one more figure inscribed there as well, and that is Yahweh, and he is not alone. In fact, one inscription says, Barachti etchem le-Yehovah Shomron ul Asheratu. In English, I have blessed you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. As a side note, I pronounce the name Yud-He-Vav-He as Yehovah because that is the most common way of pronouncing this name, if it is even mentioned at all. The people who inscribe this may not have pronounced it this way. If you recall earlier, I quoted the Old Testament illustrating that Ahab built an Asherah. Well, this was the same period of the Kuntilat Arjud inscriptions. It is clear she was incredibly popular during this period. There are other inscriptions that consistently associate Yahweh with Asherah as well. Many believe that during this time Asherah was considered the divine consort and queen to Yehovah, or Yahweh. Professor Eulen, a Brown University professor and author of Asherah and the Cult of Yahweh, states, the goddess Asherah was an acceptable and legitimate part of Yahweh's cult in non-Deuteronomistic circles. The association of the Asherah and the cult of Yahweh suggests in turn that Asherah was the consort of Yahweh in circles both in the north and south. Will Deaver, the author of Did God Have a Wife, pretty much said the same thing. He mentions in the book that during archaeological digs, many female figurines were found and that are part of Israelite folk religion, or as Eulen called it, non-Deuteronomistic circles. Yahweh was often depicted as having Asherah as a consort. She was known as the Queen of Heaven, and during certain festivals the Hebrews would bake cakes in her honor. In light of this, I suppose that the prophet Jeremiah was talking about Asherah when he writes, in chapter 7, verse 18, the children gather wood and the fathers kindle the fire, and the women knead the dough to make the cakes to the Queen of Heaven. There you have it, my friends, 2 chapters from my book Asherah, the Queen of Heaven, Canaanite Magick Book 1, which is in pre-release right now. You can get it on Amazon.com. I hope you enjoyed these 2 chapters. I have really enjoyed writing this book. I hope to see you soon. So mote it be.